just saw the 10 influential book tags going around and I wanted to contribute mine. No one tagged me or anything, but I wanted to do it, so I'm doing it. I'm not really going to be providing a description on the books, but I will give a hopefully brief reason for why they're on my list. The first books I'm going to talk about are really two books, so I'm cheating already. They are the Boxcar Children series and the Cam Jansen series. These are the two first books that I remember reading. English isn't my first language. I learned English when I was about 5 years old, and then I didn't really start reading until probably 2 years later, and I have really distinct memories of finding both of these books. I know that they set me off on my reading path, so that's why they're on the list. Number 2 on my list is Ramona Quimby, the Ramona Quimby books. These are on my list because Ramona Quimby was the first character that I ever related to, that I really saw myself in. These are the only books that I've gone back to as an adult somewhat frequently because I still marvel at Beverly Cleary's ability to write children so truthfully. I really loved Ramona so much, and I felt when I was a kid like I was Ramona. I remember there was this one specific chapter where she's talking about how it was the fad at her school to bring in a hard-boiled egg. Every day all the cool girls had their moms pack them a hard-boiled egg in their lunch, and they would bring it and they would crack it over their head and eat it, and it was just the coolest thing to do. And of course Ramona wanted to be just as cool as them, so she asked her mom to pack her a hard-boiled egg, and her mom accidentally packed her a raw egg, and then she went to school and she cracked it over her head and the egg just oozed down her face, and then I think she threw up after that. And I remember being like, that could so easily happen to me like next week. I was like in 3rd grade when I read that. So yeah, Ramona. Love, so much love for Ramona. The next books on my list are pretty popular. I think you've heard of them. They're the Harry Potter books. I think more than any other book on this list, these books are really the ones that I grew up with. I was the same age as Harry with each book. I was 11 years old when I picked up the first one, and he's 11, and then I was 12 when he was 12. By the time that I read the 7th one, I was 17 years old, Harry was 17, and I read it probably a month before moving away from home. So these books just represent my whole adolescence. And they're really the first place that I learned about a lot of real world things. There's so many parallels that you can make between what happens in the books and what has happened, you know, throughout our history. I think Harry Potter was the first place that I learned about hate crimes, and I mean, the whole notion of pure blood could so easily be tied to Nazi Germany, the Death Eaters, KKK. There's just so many parallels. I singled out this one. I think The Order of the Phoenix is probably my favorite, but I have love for all of them. This book coincided with a time in my life where I really started questioning institutions, and Order of the Phoenix really focuses on not only the Ministry of Magic, but also the institution of school, and how, you know, teachers and government officials aren't always right, and sometimes there can be a lot of corruption there. And then it was so empowering to read about the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army, and how little unimportant people can come together and unite and really fight these systems of oppression. So this is the one that I probably reread the most often because I feel kind of empowered after that. Yeah, Harry Potter, forever. The next book that I want to talk about is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So when I was in 8th grade, just shy of turning 13, I was 12 years old, my teacher assigned A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and I could not make head or tail of it. I was so lost. I remember feeling so stupid while trying to read this book. Then almost immediately afterwards, for our winter break assignment, she told us that we had to read Great Expectations. And I remember starting the vacation with a sense of complete and total dread, like, oh my god, This book is even longer than A Tale of Two Cities, and it's by the same author. How am I ever going to get through it? And then I started reading it one day. I just kind of pried it open, full of fear, and I loved it, and I couldn't put it down. Um, and so, because I read it more than a decade ago, I'm fuzzy on the plot. I need to reread it for sure to have a firmer grasp on what it is. But it deserves a place on my list because it was the book that gave me confidence as a reader and helped me realize that I did have the capacity to read denser books. The next book on my list is 1984 by George Orwell. I read this in freshman year of high school, and it was the first book that made me look up my society and that 1984 Big Brother is watching you kind of way. I was terrified when I read it, again over a decade ago, but I think about it constantly and I haven't forgotten the major themes, and I make even more parallels the more time goes by between the book and the world that I live in. The next book on my list is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This is an extremely depressing book, but I chose it because it, for the first time, made me look at my own role in the world's injustices, especially as a consumer. The next book on my list is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This book just changed my life. I don't have words to adequately describe how, but it made me look at the power of language in a new way. It made me really read for the first time all the things that are unsaid and that are so difficult to articulate, but she articulated them, and I think I'm going to do a separate video on this one, but one of the most important books I've ever read, To the Lighthouse. The next book on my list is actually the only one that I haven't finished, and it's A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. It basically chronicles American history from the point of view of the oppressed groups whose perspective is usually ignored by all of the mainstream textbooks that most of us have grown up using. I've been reading this for a couple years now. At first, I couldn't get past the Native American chapter. I would just read it and reread it and reread it. Every time I wanted to read any Howard Zinn, I would just reread that one completely powerful chapter. I find it still really hard to get through this book in one sitting. That's a whole lot of groups that have gotten screwed over throughout our history, and it's sad. So I can't really read it cover to cover the way I sometimes wish that I could. But I've been picking up steam lately. Lately I've been reading like a chapter every 4 days. So I'm making progress. I'll probably be finished sometime in March. So not only have I really appreciated the perspective of all these groups that have been marginalized throughout our history, but the other thing that I really love is that he really focuses on how these groups and individuals within these groups have stood up and fought against the oppression. It made me realize that throughout my education, history has always been taught as the oppressed groups really doing nothing to stand up for themselves, and then some hero coming along and standing up for his or her group, and that being what led to this great change. A few examples are our focus on Martin Luther King, our story about Rosa Parks, who refused to sit in the back of the bus. Rosa Parks wasn't just some random lady who just happened to get fed up one day. This is how she's described in all of our textbooks, as this kind of random old lady, and she was actually a seasoned activist, and she had been very involved in the civil rights movement for a long time. But I think it's done very purposely, the teaching of history this way, because it teaches us that we need heroes and that one individual person can't stand up and fight against injustices. This book is really full of different nobodies who banded together and rebelled time and time again. He talks about the Native Americans rebelling, and the slaves rebelling even way before the Civil War. Um, and so it's very empowering. This book is full of empowering rebellion, and that's the main reason it's on my list. The next book on my list is Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger. This book completely changed my life. There's this one bit that I can never get out of my head, and it's about sort of taking ownership over your creative life, and I had never read anything like that before. The first time I read it, it moved me, it was beautiful, but the second time I read it, it literally took the wind out of me. This book means a lot to me, and it changed how I felt about myself as a creative person, and yeah. The last book on my list is Just Kids by Patti Smith. I just think it's a shimmering jewel of a book. It's so beautiful and it's so inspiring. So the last 3 years or so, one of the major themes in my head has been courage, and I don't necessarily mean that I have been super courageous in the last few years, but it's just something that I think about a lot. I'm always asking myself how courageous I've been lately, or what brave choices can I make. Every time that I'm faced with a decision where one choice is the clearly braver one and one is the safer one, I think of Patti Smith and Just Kids. I just think about that book constantly, and all the brave choices that she made to live her creative life. So it's going to stick with me forever, and I just think everyone needs to read this book.